Thank you for joining me. My name is Diana of Webinars by Rockwell. This video is designed with the administrative professional in mind and the unique job duties and tasks that we are assigned every day. With over 40 years of experience as a secretary, administrative assistant, and executive assistant, I hope my experiences and skill sets can help you excel in your chosen or fallen into profession. I appreciate your choosing to spend the next few minutes with me as we discuss the art of communication. Let's get started. We've all heard the typical top 10 ways to communicate effectively, which identifies the categories of communication. What you don't see discussed is what method of communication should be used for the type of communication you are sending. We will first discuss the main ideas and then take a deeper dive into how to use the tools you have for communication. Our four main topics today are know your message, know your audience, expectation in response, and deadlines and follow-up. Know your message. Before you start writing, know what you want to express. Whether it's a question, a request, an update to a project, or letting your boss know you've completed a task or are out sick that day, the approach will be different. Realize that everyone works differently. For years, interoffice communication was done by phone calls or paper memos. They have been replaced by email, texts, Teams, and other software chat, and for those who are blurters, stopping by someone's desk to speak to them. With every new boss, one of the first questions I ask is what type of learner they are. Do they prefer to get emails, voicemails, or documents printed and put on their desks? If you don't know what type of learner your boss is, you can end up with miscommunications and misunderstandings. After that has been determined, you'll want to hone the method of communication to your favorite. If they would rather have email instead of Teams chat messages, then use the email. I worked in IT for 10 years at a small private college in upstate New York. As the non-technical person who placed orders and kept things going in the department, I watched as Teams became their favorite way to communicate. Phone calls, staff messages, send files, request parts orders, everything. For me, it was difficult to keep up with 5 or more different ways to communicate and only one with a way to keep items pending, such as my Outlook email. Number 2, draft your message. I took a journalism course in high school. The short 10-week course was part of a building block of English class, and we took 4 mini-mesters every year. What we learned in that course has stayed with me through all my 40-some years of working in the field, and I often use those 5 W's as the outline for my communications. Who, what, when, where, and why are the 5 W's. You may not need to use them all, especially if you're simply reporting and updating someone or reminding them of a meeting. Another journalism principle is to state the more important information first. This stems from running out of room in the newspaper column, so it will fit. And it's still a good advice now. Instead of ramping up to your important information, say it first and then the lesser important of the information as the email progresses. You will always lose some of your audience the wordier you become. So try to keep it short, concise, and to the point as much as possible. And edit your message. When I proofread each email before it's sent, I always have the 5 W's in the back of my mind and wonder what questions will be asked that I didn't address. It may feel redundant because the last 2 emails you sent on this matter included those details, but trust me on this, include them again. There will always be that person who did not read the other emails and will only read this one. Use all your proofreading skills, even on an email, and especially when the intended recipient is a supervisor or a level of management above your position. One method is to print it and read it from the bottom up and backwards. That should catch any spelling errors, but when you read it for content, after you set it aside for a few minutes, your brain can trick us in believing it's written correctly, when in the eyes of someone else, it's obviously not. We fill in gaps in our heads, reorder the characters to match what it's supposed to say and not what it does say. It is important, if it's a very important message, to ask someone else to read it for that reason alone. Know your audience. When you write anything, you must know your target audience before beginning. When I write my presentations, I know I'm writing for my fellow admins and not students in the 3rd grade. It would make a huge difference in how I worded my points and approached my topics. Everyone works differently. Realizing that everyone works differently is huge. When working one-on-one with your boss, and especially with multiple bosses, they may each have a different preferred method of communication. As the rockstar admin you are, you will be able to navigate the differences and know what method is right for each. Verbiage to peer versus superior. Your verbiage should change when communicating with a colleague as opposed to your boss or supervisor. You can be more casual with a peer than you can with a supervisor. Always use correct grammar with any communication, but you can get away with an LOL here or there with a peer, but not with your supervisor. Keep your communication positive whenever possible, and don't whine to the boss unless you have a recommendation on how to fix the issue. Reply versus reply all. That dreaded reply all. I heard a story some years ago from Linda Ellerby. She was a reporter, and I think this was on Nickelodeon when it was first launched. She wrote an email complaining about her current boss and accidentally sent it to that boss instead of her coworker. Ultimately, she was fired from that job and learned a lifelong lesson. We've all done it in one way or another. You intend to send a critique of an email string to another party only to send it back to the person you got it from. Since that happens with some regularity, always be mindful of the tone and voice of your communication. Derogatory comments and whining comments do not go over well when sent back to the person you're complaining about. I try to keep the personality out of my communication, so if someone is standing behind the person getting it would not be offended if they were the involved party. I want to give you one word of advice. I work in a corporate culture where each department is different and managed differently. One office in particular has been trained by their superior to include them on any contentious communication. Unfortunately, things can be tense while discussing certain scenarios. This office likes to change procedures but not tell anyone. So what you did last week is no longer allowed, and they make one specific person the bearer of bad news, which is a horrible way to treat someone. So things can get tense with this person that's been called out. That's when the messenger starts copying her boss and your boss. It feels like those tattletale kids in elementary school and trying to get someone in trouble. I think it's immature and unprofessional, but that's what their culture is. It's a hard battle to fight. Colleagues and vendors. As time goes by, we become friendly with both colleagues and vendors. Always keep in mind that your colleagues are an active working relationship that can go sour if you let it or if it accidentally becomes insulting to someone. Vendors, on the other hand, are paid to work for us, and they should be trying to make things right with us. I've become somewhat friendly with our cell phone sales rep, having dealt with him for over 10 years. He talks to me about his children, and we got chummier during the COVID pandemic because we were both trying to find devices to assist us in changing over from in-person classes to remote learning at the college. That does not, however, mean that I won't call him out on something if it goes wrong. It may be more difficult to do so to a colleague, and you may need to go to a higher management level to address an issue with a colleague. The vendor, not so much. You might want to pass it by your supervisor just in case there's something going on with that relationship you're unaware of. I am the liaison for the IT vendors for billing. I'll call and email them immediately if an invoice is incorrect. There's no yelling or blaming involved, just a statement of fact. Keep your communication factual and remove the feelings, and you'll be successful in the communication. If you do not receive the result you wanted, you can always bring in your boss to finalize the issue. Expectation in response. If your message requires a response, it needs to be worded so your intended information request is clear. I had an incident recently where I ordered an IT part called a patch cable for our network engineer. He sent me a link to order from Amazon, and I ordered 2 of the item as requested. He did not make it clear that he needed the length to be 2 meters and not 1 meter, as was selected in the link. When the part came in, all he said was he got the wrong thing and you only ordered 1, meaning I ordered 1 meter in length and not 2 meters. Not that I only ordered 1 unit and not the 2 he requested. It was a huge miscommunication, and he felt that I was a little too aggressive in my response, and he still thinks I did it wrong, and I'm just going to have to let it go. The first question you need to ask is, do you expect a response? If your communication needs a response, make it clear that you expect to have a response by a certain date and possibly time. I pick Friday noon a lot just because it gives people time and gives me time to deal with it after I receive it. Giving a time will help the recipient prioritize their workload and still give you what you need in a timely manner. I've actually said in an email, I don't expect a response, but that's usually when I'm calling out a vendor for mistreatment or dropping the ball on an order or a repair. Is it information only? If your communication does not need a response and is information only, be sure that's what you've said. It may help to use bullet points rather than prose to explain something. Some people read too fast or skim the text of a communication and do not always see the hidden question at the end of paragraph 3. How many times have you sent an email and given all the information only to have someone respond to ask the date of the event when it's clearly stated in your communication? Way too often. I recently had an interaction with a filmmaker who was invited to present his award-winning film for a diversity film series we were hosting at the college. He was communicating with our associate provost, who has known him since college, and they're both in their 50s. Unfortunately, our staff person went into the hospital and was not able to complete the travel arrangements, so it was left to me to scramble the week of the event and complete them in 3 days' time without the one person who offered to pick the guest up at the airport and take him around town as needed. As I communicated with the filmmaker, I asked 3 questions: his dietary restrictions for dinner, if he can arrange his own flight and we would reimburse him, and I asked him to complete and sign a W-9 form so we could pay him. His only response was his address. Frustrated that he didn't respond with the info I needed, I decided to use bullet points with space between them. Apparently, he skims emails and was one of those people whose brain works really fast, so short, concise communication was best for that scenario. My original email was correct in every way except for its intended audience. He did not respond well to prose, so the bullet points did the trick. Is it a discussion? Do you intend your communication to be a back and forth type of discussion? If so, perhaps an email is not the best method to communicate. We've all run into these scenarios where your recipient just doesn't stop asking questions, and you end up with a string of 8 or 10 emails just to clarify things. Try a chat tool or a phone call, or even a short trip to their office if they're internal. Is it a report or an update? You can't make the committee meeting because of a prior commitment, but you need to send an update to the committee. Unless it's a formal report, an email would be best, and use bullet points to answer questions about your portion of the task being performed, and that would probably be the most appropriate in that scenario. Deadlines and follow-up. Our last item of deadlines and follow-up may seem silly to remind you of. However, many people do not give deadlines and don't plan a follow-up to get their information. If you request a response, add the deadline as we spoke of earlier. Often I ask for information that needs to be included in another report to a higher management level. Since that report has a deadline or a scheduled meeting involved, I'll ask for the information to be sent to me with enough time to turn that around and include it in the report. Explain why you have a deadline and why you need the information. Many companies have siloed departments and they don't share unless it's necessary. So if I ask the admissions office how many students have registered and deposited in mid-May for the August start of classes, they may not want to share that just yet. By sharing the fact that the marketing director needs to use those numbers for their president's report to validate the amount of advertising they're doing, it should be easier to get that information. Remember to always pad your deadline to give yourself time to turn around the information, and in case it's delivered late, you still have some time. If someone requests something from you and they don't give a time, please ask for one. That will help you know how to prioritize and get the information back to the requester in time for their needs. Preemptive reminders. It's sometimes worth your time and effort to send a preemptive reminder about a meeting or a report being due. People are busy and they may not have the cohesive pending system that you do. I work with a board of directors or trustees often. I take notes for a couple of the committees, and it's always helpful to send a reminder email about the next meeting. When I first took this over from someone who retired, I received no training and no one shared expectations. I did read old agendas and notes to see the style used, whether it's rigid minutes or casually paraphrased notes. What I didn't know was that they needed to be reminded of the monthly meeting a week in advance. And the reminder must also include the Zoom meeting link and associated information. Couple that with changes of email addresses, and we had some harrowing moments in the first few months. And we even missed a meeting for which I was totally embarrassed and felt guilty for days. Past due reminders. If your deadline is missed, give them a day or two if time allows it, and send another reminder. I have a weekly deadline on Wednesdays at noon to submit vouchers and invoices to be paid. As I found out recently, if you're a couple minutes late, forget having it included. The check queue is determined by that time and there's no adding another invoice to it. Thankfully, other deadlines are more flexible. When I was in IAAP as the division leader, we published a newsletter with department updates once or twice a month. The newsletters are shared with the president's cabinet as well as every other member in the division. We have a deadline of every other week, Friday at noon, and hopefully it goes out. I have the same type of scenario with my work division. We call ourselves the ACT division for Advancement Communications and Technology, and that includes fundraising, alumni relations, community events, our internal conference services thrown in, as well as marketing. So we do the same type of newsletter every other week. On Friday, we send out just an update for what's going on in our division so everyone is aware of what's coming up. So keep track. Develop your own method of tracking pending items. I use several different methods depending on the way it was communicated. For example, when I send an email asking for a response, I blind copy myself and leave it unread until I get the response. If it's not what I was hoping for, I'll send another email to clarify or what have you, and remove the first request from pending, and the new email replaces it. If it's complicated, like doing a meeting for over 5 different people, I'll print out the request, I'll write their names in the margin, find suitable times for each, record that on the email hard copy, and send a separate email asking which day and time works for everyone. I mark my hard copy with the date and time that email was sent, and it goes into my pending work folder, which I review daily, sometimes more than once. I also use a long-term to-do list. I do not use the tactic of writing my first line item of the day to write a to-do list so I can cross something off first thing in the day and feel accomplished. That tactic does not work for me, but if it does for you, by all means, use whatever works. The long-term to-do list usually includes things that need to be done with a longer time frame, like travel plans for a visitor 3 months out, or has many moving parts and needs input from other people. According to the article by Spectrio from January of 2021, there are 18 concepts of communication. We're only going to share the top 10. Each item is provided by an industry leader like Reid Hoffman, who was the founder of LinkedIn and PayPal, Bill Gates of Microsoft, Ryan Holmes, who is the CEO of Hootsuite, Joseph Badaracco, professor of business ethics at Harvard Business School, and Bob Parsons, founder of GoDaddy, just to name a few. Number 1 is envision, strategize, and plan. Number 2, use the right tools. 3, be visual. 4, make communications entertaining. 5, include metrics when possible and appropriate. 6, don't lose sight of the big picture. 7, provide channels for feedback. 8, encourage cross-department collaborations. 9, avoid communication overload. And 10, don't just inform, inspire. So now that we know what to say conceptually, we need to start looking at the best method to convey your message. As the admin, you have a preferred method to communicate, but based on what we just discussed, when is the proper time to use email, make a phone call, use Teams chat, text messaging? When is it appropriate to just forget all that and set up a meeting? Or do I write a formal letter and mail it? Can you envision a different purpose for each method? Let's take them one at a time. Emails have replaced much of the letter writing of the past. Businesses email each other rather than do any formal letter writing. I once worked for a very conservative office that insisted that our emails appear in the format of a letter with the inside salutation and closing, and including attachments with CC notations. Emails are the most commonly used business communication, including into office purposes. We email our faculty, staff, and students with updates about the college, make announcements of events, snow days, emergency outages, deadlines for registering for classes, and graduation. Unfortunately, the spammers took note and began hacking into people's emails and sending bogus messages to people on your contact list. Bill Gates suggested many years ago that charging 1 cent per email would stop the spamming, and he's probably right, but no one wanted to go that far. Emails are good for sharing information, requesting information, updating or conveying a report, attaching documents, and a host of other purposes. When do I make a phone call? Phone calls are for quick back and forth discussions unless you're not able to meet with the person because of distance or logistics. Many of my vendor contacts are done by phone. People call me with quick questions that they think I can answer off the top of my head. I receive calls for donations through credit cards or requests for meetings with my boss. When do I use Teams chat function or other chat functions? Teams, by its intended nature, is internal communication. We have included inviting external people in one of their upgrades last year due to the competition with Zoom. My organization uses both depending on the purpose of the meeting. Teams chat allows a quick back and forth between colleagues, but should not be used to transmit documents unless it's information use only. There's not an easy way to pull out a conversation or save or print it so that it can be one of your pending items. I've lost sight of orders and documents sent to me on Teams because the most recent chat activity is sorted at the top. Teams also allows a video phone call, which, like the Jetsons cartoon back in the 1960s, you can turn off your camera and use a static image like I do. I'm terribly non-photogenic. And if a larger meeting or your dog starts to bark or the baby's crying, you can mute your microphone very easily. I've been on large calls with like 25 people. This was a time when we were only doing phone calls and not video calls. It was at a time frame where people were getting home from work. We were from all across the country, so some were still at work, others were commuting, and some were fixing dinner. During one call, the person left their microphone on while she was opening and shutting cupboards. The TV was on quite loudly, and she got into an argument with her spouse, all captured by the microphone. Technology has advanced to where we can automatically mute all participants and they can unmute themselves when it's their turn to talk. We've all seen the bloopers from Zoom calls where the reporter was making her live broadcast in her kitchen with her husband showering in the background with the door open. And of course, other people who are scantily dressed and their dog pulls the power cord, or they forgot to and stood up in full view of other participants and they're only in their underwear. One company asked their employees to come back to work dressed as they did for their Zoom meetings, and the picture was interesting to say the least. Early pandemic, Target released a new line of clothes with professional attire for the top and casual attire for the bottoms, just for your Teams and Zoom calls. Zoom, on the other hand, is designed for video conferences up to 300 people, where the presenter speaks and the attendees just listen. You can call in with no video as well and just listen on your phone. When do I use text messaging? Depending on your corporate culture, texting is reserved for those with company-owned phones or consent to use a personal phone for business purposes. We tend to use texts as an emergency situation, or if, for example, the internet is down across campus, or the water will be shut off in the next day in the building, literally this just happened, then the department will send out a text to staff only. It's a hands-on-deck call to service for IT. If my boss needs me to stop by the mailroom and pick up a package on my way into the office, he'll text me in the morning or last thing at night. An email wouldn't work. People ask why, and I say, hourly employees aren't supposed to be monitoring their emails unless they're punched in, and many do not look at their email until they're at their desks. If you use texting to request someone to do something, please remember the capabilities of the system. You can't mark it as unread easily, and you can't pull it out into a task. Make it short and easy to remember because your recipient has to remember to do that task. I can't tell you the number of times I forgot to pick up my boss when she was having her car fixed for that very reason. So when do I set up a meeting? When you have a complicated or multifaceted situation, you should set up a meeting or a phone call. The meeting is best utilized for multiple people with a common purpose, file sharing or imparting of information so the boss doesn't have to repeat themselves 12 different times for each attendee. Try using a stand-up meeting format. That means you don't sit down, but still have a meeting. It makes them shorter because no one is comfortable and unnecessary chatter is avoided. When do I write and mail a letter? Conservative companies, lawyers, insurance companies, banks, the IRS, will probably always need to send letters. They're falling by the wayside very quickly. However, there are still enough people in the U.S. without computers or the lack of knowledge of how to open and manipulate a document to make letter writing a preferred method of communication. Unless your parents insisted you write thank you notes for your birthday gifts, Many of today's college students do not know how to address an envelope, and I am dead serious about that. I work closely with the people who run our mailroom and copy center, and you would not believe some of the things that go through their office. Even professionals design postcards with no room for the address or the stamp. It's incredible. Where I work now, we use letters to thank people for donations. They need the letter for tax purposes, and it gives us an opportunity to communicate directly with that donor. My direct report vice president will very often add a personal note to each letter, which makes it great for the donor. Grant proposals are now submitted online for most part, but the acceptances can fade through a formal letter. Much of academia is still what people would call old-fashioned. It takes them much longer than corporate to accept new systems and manner of communication. We're still mailing checks instead of using ACH or EFT payments to our vendors. Communication is fraught with verbal, nonverbal, and social cues. It is very subjective, and its intent may not always be evident. By realizing how your audience best receives information and using that method, you will have success. Keep in mind that your communication will succeed if you present your message in the format and manner the recipient is receptive to. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Webinars by Rockwell specialize in videos to train admins and help them enhance their skills so they can become that rockstar admin they've always dreamed of being. Check back for additional videos released at the first of each month. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, in addition to Teachable, where these videos are available for purchase. Bye for now.